After rewatching the Onderon Arc, I decided that I had to make this video, especially since I don't think what I'm about to talk about has been touched on, and it's a shame because I have to give the Clone Wars credit where credit is due. They did a pretty good job with this arc, in some really interesting and clever ways, namely how it relates back to history. Now, I'm going to go in chronological order of this arc and analyze it as we go. In the first episode, the planet Onderon is introduced as a neutral planet in the Clone Wars, and has a CIS-leading government with CIS support. This parallels the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan very closely, with the socialist government backed by the Soviets, the CIS taking on the role of the Soviets, the rebels, the Mujahideen, and the Republic, the United States, and Onderon, of course, the Afghan government. Now, the reasons behind the Republic not being able to go in directly aren't well explained, especially given that they're in an all-out war against the Separatists, but I'm guessing it had something to do with Onderon not being an official part of the Separatists, but just receiving weapons and equipment from the Separatists in the form of tanks and battle droids. Anyways, the Republic doesn't want to be seen as interfering in the internal affairs of the planet, so it begins backing the Mujahideen, I mean the terrorists, I mean the rebels with advisors, equipment, and giving them knowledge to fight the Onderon government. Now, later we realize that while the government has control of the cities, the rebels control much of the wilderness and have a lot of freedom to operate. In response, the Soviets launch an all-out attack on the training camp, but are ultimately defeated. I said Soviets, didn't I? I'm sorry. This all parallels, of course, the actual situation during the conflict. In fact, it was estimated the Soviets only had a firm grip on 20% of the country. However, the recurring theme of the arc was that the Republic could only protect the insurgents, not fight for them. Now, Ahsoka throughout the arc breaks this many times, but goes far more in depth than the US did, which usually operated through Pakistani intelligence, unless you count Rambo. Now, the next parallels come in the second and third episodes and are more general, relating to the counterinsurgency specifically. Now, the views on those who should carry out those operations. Firstly, the idea of lack of government control. According to a document published by the Joint Chiefs of Staff on counterinsurgency, with real or perceived lack of government control can allow insurgents to operate with little or no interference from security forces or other agencies. Thus, as battle droids are destroyed and public support for the regime fades, the rebels can just gain more and more freedom of operation. Furthermore, it states specifically in bold print that the military instrument is only one part of a comprehensive approach for successful counterinsurgency, or COIN, which is the abbreviation for it. However, again, the Separatists refuse any form of negotiations, any sort of aid, any sort of reconciliation to address the threats, and in fact just go on to exacerbate the issues, which is that this king is viewed as a Separatist puppet, a Separatist pawn. And so, because they aren't doing anything to address that, it just ends up further empowering the rebels. Now, here is where the Onderonian general actually suggests that local forces take over the policing, and the Separatists just say, you know what, we'll just kill them all, and if anyone tries to join, we'll just kill all of them. However, the CIS way of thinking is difficult, especially given the idea that the military instrument is only one part of the solution. And so it tends to create a lot more enemies that it defeats. So even if you have a ton of successful battles and you're defeating a lot of insurgents, several more will take their place if the people feel that they aren't being protected but being occupied or oppressed by a foreign power, in this case the Separatists. And all this does is allow the insurgents to gain sympathy and get recruits and support from the locals. Now, during Vietnam, the United States used the strategy of trying to win the quote-unquote hearts and minds of the Vietnamese. However, the Viet Cong propaganda and their strategies made this difficult. On the other hand, while using local forces like the Onderonian general suggests, have their advantages, such as not being seen as an occupying force, and they have knowledge of terrain, local cultures, local languages, but may not be the most professional. It may require a lot of time of training and rehabilitation to become a capable fighting force. Now, going back to the Chiefs of Staff, the key to achieving long-term stability and development is the establishment of the local government as the legitimate and effective governing authority. To achieve this, the reconstruction teams or the forces that are staying behind in order to help train and rebuild the country will need to lead from behind and underneath, building capacity and working behind the scenes to ensure host nation ownership and promoting host nation primacy and legitimacy. Now, applied to Star Wars, basically what the CIA should do is rebuild the Onderonian military to protect itself instead of relying on the battle droids, so that the government can be seem as legitimate as possible to the people, especially given this is one of the key concerns. However, instead, the Separatists begin imposing their expertise instead of accepting the general solution, which is actually directly against what the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually recommend, that sometimes basically the host nation needs to fail and needs to be allowed to accept its own solutions instead of being overbearing and imposing your expertise. You're just a tool to aid in their rehabilitation and in regaining their legitimacy and stability. Now, in the 4th episode is where the comparison between Afghanistan becomes extremely apparent. So the king has, by this point, lost popular support, and the public turned against him, but the Soviets sent Mi-24 Hind attack helicopters to engage the Mujahideen in the mountains. I mean, CIS and droid gunships to engage the rebels in the mountains, launching search and destroy missions. Now, the search and destroy missions are a staple of the United States strategy in Vietnam and later in Afghanistan. Basically, the idea is to land a bunch of troops, clear out the enemy from an area, get back on the helicopters, and go back to base. Do damage, and get back out. And then, tomorrow go out and do the same thing, hit another area, and you get the picture. Just keep going. Take out recruitment centers, radio stations, anything that might be of use. And to do this, the Separatists use droid gunships, armed with rockets and numerous laser cannons. I'm going to sidestep this review a bit and just say I love the droid gunship. It's definitely one of, if not my favorite Star Wars vehicles. It doesn't only look Star Wars, but also has a practical purpose, and seems like it's designed for that purpose, and it basically comes across as the Star Wars version of the Apache. But back to the review. So the rebels can't deal with this new threat because of their shields, just like how small arms fire was largely ineffective against the Hind helicopters, requiring new weapons. Speaking of which, Stingers. So the Republic sends rocket launchers to stop the droid gunships. Whoop! Oh, sorry. Editing mistake. Well, screw it. Just gonna leave it in. And yes, I'm using the joke again. I know. Anyways, we get a nice picture of Osama bin Laden using a Stinger missile to destroy a Hind gunship. Oh, okay, I'll stop. You get the picture. Anyways, in real life, in order to keep the Mujahideen afloat, the United States sent Stinger missiles, which are MANPADS, or Man-Portable Air Defense Systems, which are AA missiles that we carried and used by infantry teams. Now, this is something that really wasn't seen before and does for air power what the bazooka and anti-tank guided missiles did to the tanks, giving the infantry the power to punch now not only against ground targets at long range, but against air threats, and well above what you would think an infantryman would be able to do, giving them a lot more power on the battlefield. Anyways, with their MANPADS in hand, the rebels are now able to deal with the gunships. And long story short, end up defeating the gunships, blah blah blah, and the just like in real life, the Soviets and the Separatists end up evacuating. However, a major divergence is in the aftermath. In the Clone Wars, things are stable, with a new government in charge and popular support and agreeing to join the Republic, and it's a largely happy ending, like the one rebel leader girl dies, but it's a sacrifice. But anyways, countries unified, yay, happy ending. However, in real life, it was a completely different story. You basically have a situation with a lot of people with guns. While you have a clear plan for rule, you have numerous factions within those, and each have their own beliefs on what should happen with the government, and has no power to actually fill the Soviets' void, and so the Mujahideen split into civil war. Looting and theft became common, and the country just broke apart. Refugees fled everywhere. It was a complete mess. Eventually, one group backed by Pakistan and its intelligence forces would come along, imposing a strict adherence to Sharia law. While this was initially supported by shop owners and such because it stopped the rioting, this group came to be known as the Taliban. And if it sounds familiar, well, they should. After a series of human rights abuses and the 9/11 attacks and the passage of the AUMF, the United States would invade Afghanistan. And given that the Taliban was harboring much of Al-Qaeda and its leadership, notably, well, I guess that leads us into the next part. Space Bin Laden. Anyways, Osama bin Laden and Saul Guerrero share a lot of similar traits, at least if you bring Rogue One into the equation. Both end up like founding extremist groups, be that Al Qaeda or the Partisans, and using similar terror tactics. And while we never see Saul Guerrero authorizing attacks similar to 9/11, we do know that he authorized many, many brutal strikes against what would be seen as collaborators with the Empire. In one attack, he used flechette launchers to absolutely massacre diplomats, just completely unarmed diplomats, that were seen as conspirators with the Empire. And so, again, we can see the parallels. Both are trained to fight either the Soviets or the Separatists, but eventually end up fighting the U.S. and the Empire. They also both live in caves and operate on mountain or desert planets and use carbines. Basically, if you put this in Rogue One, it actually places the Empire in the same position as the United States and its allies in Afghanistan. That's a topic for another day, but it's really interesting to see Star Wars get into this debate, if you will. Now, that concludes much of my comparison of my arc. Let me know if you think I missed anything, but personally, I think this was one of the better done arcs in the Clone Wars, and I really love that show. It's so much better than Rebels. I love Thrawn, but the Clone Wars, I mean, we got to see Soviet gunship engage the Republic-backed Mujahideen. It just, wow. I can't go on and say that I didn't like this arc. Now, I just wanted to touch on some random parts that I thought weren't as good and, just were kind of silly, but just weren't related to the Afghanistan parallel. First off, the king is absolutely stupid and completely incompetent, and he actually thinks that the predecessor is behind the attacks, which is completely insane. The king has zero way to communicate with the outside, and he's been basically in lockdown, and they've been watching him no matter what. So, really, he thinks that he's behind this, but this is completely paranoid and ridiculous. This guy must have an IQ of 60 if he thinks that the king is actually behind this just because one of the terrorist names dropped him. I'm seriously, I'm sorry. But anyways, in fact, they actually end up missing, in my opinion, a huge opportunity to have the king, broadcast a message condemning the violence, saying that terrorism isn't the answer to perceived injustice. And to be honest, the Seps really aren't all that bad in this arc. That is, they really aren't doing villainous things. Obviously, they're the enemy in the Clone Wars, but, I mean, all they're really doing is patrolling the streets and going after terrorists who are trying to depose the government. I mean, if you frame it in that mind, they really aren't the bad guys. And I think that does a decent job paralleling the Cold War, where the Soviets to the United States are the bad guys, but, obviously the Soviets had their own war crimes and such in Afghanistan that I'm not going to get into. But, it certainly could be made a case for that, a socialist Afghanistan might have been better. Anyways, I'm not going to get into that whole argument. But, it is an interesting parallel to see the Separatists in this way. And then there's the part where the rebels blow up the power station. And let's think about this for a second. If your power went out, just a normal citizen with a, normal 9-to-5 job, are you going to be happy when your power goes out? Oh boy, that was a long day at work. I better get this report done for my boss, and I wonder what's going to be on the holonet. Just about to complete the report for your boss when the power goes out right before the winning play of your favorite team, and then you go to check the refrigerator, and you realize that all your food is going to spoil before hearing on an emergency radio that terrorists were responsible for it. And now you can't access the holonet, you can't watch, your YouTube, and you can't really go out at night to restock your food because you might get mugged now that there aren't any lights, and the droids can't see, and the water purification plant, it doesn't have power either. Okay, I think I've made my point. This would not go over very well for terrorists. If I heard that someone had decided to take out the power plant, and right in the middle of editing this episode or something, I would not be happy. And then there's also the idea that of going after the battle droids, especially it's not really clear, though it's kind of implied that the public is against initially killing the battle droids and they're fearful, because these are their public protectors, as it seems, and it's kind of like killing a police officer. It's that's not going to get you anywhere. So yeah, and besides, they can literally just make more. It's not like you're really getting a qualitative edge over your opponent by doing that. Oh, and then there's the capital city, which is named ISIS.
We'll save him for all of ISIS to witness.
So if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe for more content. It really does help the channel grow if you like it, and I hope you want more people to see it. Maybe if you don't like it, then yeah, okay. Yeah, that one's somewhere weird. But anyways, just click the button. I know you've probably done it a million times before. That's probably why you're here. Anyways, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please leave your feedback in the comments. I thought this was a really interesting episode, and at least interesting to make. So yeah, have a good day. And this is RC0538 signing off.